Here we're going to look at how a variety of tinders of different grades burn. So within any good tinder bundle, there'll be a gradation of materials to help nurture a very small heat source into a hearty flame. So for example, here we've got a tinder bundle with 4 kind of layers to it. You've got a King Alfred's cake in the middle as a very first tinder, leading into the fluff of reed mace as a transition tinder to help smoulder that heat source large enough that the more fibrous inner bark can catch alight. And finally, it's all held together by bracken here as an outer, more coarse fibrous material. But there's many different examples of each of these layers, and it's good to know the principle of what you're looking for with a range of examples that you can find in different natural environments. So here we go. So tinder is all about where the heat meets the fuel. We're going to generate some small sources of heat, generally with using sparks, and show you how different tinders respond to the sparks and enable them to strengthen, becoming big enough to blow into flame later on. This is Ganadernum fungus, the layer just below the hard cortex, and you can see it's really effective at catching sparks and helping them smoulder and strengthen. Here you can see sparks onto King Alfred's cake, and it's caught the spark and being blown into the fungus. King Alfred's cakes hold embers really well for a long time and can make a very strong heart to a tinder bundle once transferred. This is tinder hoof fungus, which was used to actually transport fire from one place to another, and you can see that it just slowly smoulders. You can even walk with it in your hand, just moving your arm back and forth through the air to keep the ember smouldering. When making fire by friction, it is the rolls of wood fibre that come off really hot that become the first tinder. Here you can see the generation of all those fibres, and inside there's an ember that's ignited. You could transfer this straight into a tinder bundle as it is, or you could strengthen it further by adding a piece of King Alfred's cake to it or such like. Here you can see a piece of char cloth or carbon cloth being lit by a spark, and you can see that that spark quickly enlarges into a bigger heat source, smouldering easily in the carbon cloth. This is a more modern first tinder that uses cotton cloth that's been transformed through heat without oxygen in a tin on a fire. And there's another video showing you what materials you need to make this and how to do it. It's difficult to categorise fibres into one kind of tinder or another, but this kind of downy fluff is really good to surround a strong ember. I don't find it very easy to catch a spark onto this kind of material, but it's very good at nurturing a strong ember and enabling it to grow into the tinder around it, cushioning the transition into the more fibrous materials. This here is reed mace fluff, and you can see even with really strong sparks it's struggling to ignite, but it will smoulder. If we just emulate that by lighting a small piece of char cloth and placing it within the reed mace fluff, you can see how it's going to strengthen a small heat source such as lit char cloth or another first tinder that's ignited. So I've sped this clip up a bit, but you can see that it's increasing the heat source and it's getting actually too hot to hold. So here you can see a bunch of fluffy dandelion seeds, and these have a similar quality to the reed mace fluff. They can ignite into flame from a spark, as you can see here, but this soon goes out and they'll have more of a smouldering quality. If we add a small piece of char cloth and blow on it as a micro tinder bundle, you can see that the fluff will sort of insulate the heat and enable it to grow into the fluff around it, just enabling that heat source to get stronger. And if it was then surrounded by other fibrous materials, this would support the transition from the char cloth into those larger fibres. So another example of these fluffy seed heads is the seeds of rosebay willow herb, also known as fireweed, and they have this white downy fluff surrounded by these slightly woodier casings that you can see in amongst the fluff. Again, in response to big sparks, they occasionally catch into flame but mainly smoulder. Again, if we introduce a small piece of char cloth to emulate the first tinders, and use the fluff as a micro tinder bundle around it, you can see that it will nurture the heat and help that transition into the more fibrous material. Another benefit of having a layer of fluff is if you're using an ember from a friction fire, the fluff actually helps sort of hold that ember together, rather than if you can imagine putting an ember straight into bracken, that ember could sort of dissipate and fall into the gaps in the bracken, whereas a bit of fluff would give that ember a little bed to nestle into. A great backup to have in your fire kit is some jute twine, gardening twine. Jute is a natural plant and the string is made out of these fibres. You can unroll the lengths of string. If you take short lengths, about 10 to 15 centimetres, the children will enjoy unrolling them and fluffing out the fibres. Sometimes we call it fairy's hair. They ignite really easily from a spark and they do burn out quickly, but if you just need to get from spark to flame and have other tinders to support your fire lighting, this is a really good backup to have. Trees with fibrous inner barks provide a wonderful resource. When living, the inner barks can be used for all sorts of crafts, making string and basket weaving. But once dead and dried, the roughed up fibres make amazing tinder bundles. You can process the inner barks so that they get fuzzier in the centre of the tinder bundle and are more roughly processed on the outside. They work really well to nurture an ember into flame. This ember has been made by friction fire, so is a more crumbly ember than some of the other forms. And once it's alight, it'll keep burning for quite a lot of time because of the quality of the fibres. In a moment you'll see a sped up version of 1.5 minutes of the fibres burning. You'll see that even when they look like they've gone out, there's a lot of heat source in there when they're blown upon. The peely outer bark of young to middle-aged birches is a brilliant fire lighting asset. They have volatile oils in them that if you rough up the surface of it a little bit and get a good spark landed, they will flame and burn for a significant amount of time. You can see here how effective they are. To add them into a tinder bundle or even into your first grade of sticks is a really helpful thing when lighting fires, especially in damp or cold and damp conditions. Here you can see purple moorgrass, and this lends itself as a tinder because it's so easy to gather vast quantities of it. I've put a very small piece of char cloth in this bundle, and the material is very dry and it doesn't take too long to ignite. You can see I've woven it into quite a dense nest. This is partly because the fibrous grass leaves are so light that they burn out very quickly, as you can see here. This footage of the tinder bundle burning is clearly sped up, but after 50 seconds of burning, the burned out tinder bundle's heart has very little heat in it left. Here you can see a tinder bundle made from both the stems and leaves of common grasses that have been really well dried out. Despite them being really dry, you can see a huge amount of smoke coming off the tinder bundle, and this is due to the waxy cuticle that grasses have to help keep the moisture in. So Anna's having to work a little bit harder than usual to get the tinder bundle into flame due to this material. Bracken works really well as tinder. It's got a large surface area, and if you harvest it early in the autumn, once it's gone brown and dry it out, it will last really well, even for a year. So we often harvest sacks of it with the children to use throughout the year because there's an abundance near us. If you harvest bracken later in the winter, it can be really crumbly. So if you're going to harvest any quantity of it, it's best to do it in the autumn when it's only just turned fully brown. You can see here that it works well as the outer mass for the tinder bundle, lighting from an ember or piece of lit charcloth. Depending on how damp it is will depend how much smoke it is and how easy it is to light, as with all tinders. And once lit, it burns brightly if it's dry and is a good start to any fire. Here you can see the tinder bundle that I made in the associated video. It's got a King Alfred cake in the centre, surrounded by some fluff and inner bark with a bit of silver birch bark, and there's a dense nest of cleavers around this as the outer material. And here you can see a bow drill ember being transferred into the bundle and brought to life. And I've sped up 5 minutes of footage of the cleavers bundle burning, and you can see how much heat remains in the bundle for quite an extended period of time without being blown upon or added any fuel. Cleavers is a brilliant tinder that we often find growing up hedgerows and fences, and it's especially good because when many other tinders are past their best, it remains in the landscape ready to be used. So I know for myself it's very easy for me to get into habits of using the same tinder again and again, maybe one that's really readily available and I know works. But I also think there's real value in exploring different materials in the landscape and wondering what else will work well as tinder. So I hope this video has inspired you to get out and experiment with new tinders. Enjoy!